Hello, New Testament studies classes. We're going to be starting a new unit on the book of Revelation and eschatology, that big fancy theological word, which means the study of the end times. But before we can get to the study of the end times, we first need to take a look at the book where most of our information about the end times comes from, and that's the book of Revelation. This week, I'm going to assign you another video from the Bible Project, which does a fantastic job of giving you an overview of each of the different chapters in the book of Revelation. It's a 2-video series. And you're also going to be reading good chunks of the book of Revelation and answering some questions as well. The main reason I want to make this video is to give you an introduction to why there are so many different interpretive approaches to the book of Revelation. Basically, why can't we all just agree on exactly what it says? Well, if you've ever read parts of the book of Revelation, you'll know that that's easier said than done. It's a book that is unlike any other book in the New Testament for sure. So let's take a look at the overview. First of all, it's written by the Apostle John, the same guy that wrote the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Towards the end of his life, he was in prison on the island of Patmos, which is a small little island off of Turkey, where he receives this revelation. We get that information right from the first chapter of the book. And the audience of the book of Revelation are these 7 churches that he writes to. Keep in mind that John, by this time, late in his life, is basically an old pastor. He's probably the only living disciple at this point. And so he is shepherding these young churches. Those churches are Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, not the one on the East Coast, and Laodicea. And so the first 3 chapters are really these specific letters that are written to those churches in a time to encourage them in their period of persecution. The theme of it is an apocalyptic revelation. Apocalypse is a type of genre in the Bible, and that just means a type of literature in the Bible, one that most people today aren't very familiar with. We don't read a whole lot of apocalyptic literature, but people in the first century were much more familiar with apocalyptic literature and its wild visions that are all revealing what God is doing in light of what's going to happen in the end. But there's also apocalyptic literature in the Old Testament, which really is critical to a proper interpretation of the book of Revelation. So now let's get into the main part of the video, and that is the 4 interpretive approaches to Revelation. You might find it new information that there are different ways to read the book of Revelation. Not all Christians have agreed throughout the past 2,000 years of Christian history. The view that we are most familiar with, usually in the evangelical churches that most students attend, is, I'll just fast forward, it's the last one, the futurist. The futurist view is that the events in the book of Revelation are describing events that have not yet taken place in the future. Even though that might be the most familiar interpretive approach to you that you've heard preached about in your churches, that's not the only view that Christians have taken for the past 2,000 years. So let's take a look at what the preterist view is. The preterist view states that all the events of Revelation were fulfilled during the period of the Roman Empire. Now, how can that be? Well, the idea here is that apocalyptic literature, preterist would say, is basically coded messages sent to encourage the Christians from those 7 churches in undergoing the extreme persecution that they were living with at that time under the Emperor Domitian and the different Roman emperors that were unleashing some really bad times of persecution on the early church. And so for a preterist, they think that many of these different visions that you're going to read in Revelation are actually targeted message, kind of like propaganda against the Roman Empire. And so if you're reading it from a preterist point of view, then the book of Revelation isn't even talking about future events. It's talking about events that have already happened. The second view, or interpretive approach, is called the historical view. This is the idea that Revelation is a panorama of church history from the apostolic era until the consummation or the end of time. So this is kind of similar to the preterist view in that it would say that many of the events in Revelation have already taken place, but the idea is that it gives a panorama or a wide view of history and how it relates to the prophecies that are contained therein. Someone reading it from the historical point of view might look at some of the events that are going on in the world right now and say, see, that's kind of been foretold right here. But you could also go back in history and see events that have been foretold as well in the book of Revelation. The historical interpretive approach is not a very popular view of Revelation, but it has been one throughout the history of the church. Next is the idealist view or interpretive approach to Revelation. The idealist view is the idea that Revelation is not a representation of actual events at all, but is rather a symbolic depiction of the spiritual warfare between good and evil. So from the idealist approach, all of the visions that you read about dragons and seven-headed beasts coming out of the water and all these different fantastical things, the idealist would say those aren't related to actual historical events. They simply represent symbolically the spiritual warfare that's been taking place throughout history, and particularly from the birth of Christ all up until our own day. So an idealist is not going to say that Revelation corresponds to actual events. And then the final interpretive approach to Revelation is the futurist approach. This is the idea that beginning with chapter 4, after the letters to those 7 churches, Revelation describes future events accompanying the end of the age. So if you've ever heard about like the tribulation or the millennium that will precede when Christ then returns to the earth, most all of those eschatologies or views of the end times are being interpreted through the lens of a futurist reading of the book of Revelation. So when you're reading the book of Revelation, you are saying, this is telling what is going to happen at some point, maybe after the rapture. It depends on if you're a pre-tribulational, a dispensational premillennialist, or a mid-trib, or we'll get into all the different views of eschatology in a later video. But the futurist approach to Revelation tends to be the most popular with most evangelical churches in today's world. But it hasn't always been that way in the past, which is why I wanted you to be familiar with these 4 different interpretive approaches. The video that you watch from the Bible Project will take you through the different seals, the different trumpets, the different plagues. You'll notice a repeating of the number 7 throughout the book of Revelation, these 7 plagues, trumpets, seals. And the last thing that I'd like to end with this video on is just the very beginning of the book of Revelation. Remember, it's not the book of Revelations, it's the book of Revelation. This Bible is so old, this is one of my first Bibles I got as a kid. The pages have all come out. So I can just flip to part of it with, there we go, Revelation chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. It says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, that's the title, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John, there's the author, who testifies to everything he saw, that is, the word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. Blessed is the one who reads the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it and take to heart what is written in it, because the time is near. So a couple things just on those first few verses. The revelation is about the revelation of Jesus Christ. As long as you keep that as the central understanding of the book of Revelation, it will help to make it more clear to you. The whole book is about Jesus. And what's the promise associated with reading this book? Those who read it and take it to heart will be blessed. It's the only book of the Bible that comes with a promised blessing for those that read it, study it, and take it to heart. Maybe that's because God knew that this book, more than any other in the Bible, would be probably the most confusing and most difficult to interpret. So receive your blessing as you start this study in the book of Revelation.